What goes through your mind when you freeze in your first combat? When bullets are snapping past your head and your body won't respond to your desperate commands to move? When you watch other men fighting and dying while you're paralyzed by a fear so overwhelming you can't even pull your rifle's trigger? And what does it mean when you survive that moment of cowardice, not through any action of your own, but through the sacrifice of men who had every reason to let you die? Can you live with that knowledge? Can you carry the weight of being saved by soldiers who deserve to live more than you did? Can you find meaning in a survival that feels more like punishment than blessing? I'm 96 years old, and in December 1944 I was a rookie private in the 99th Infantry Division, who froze in his first combat during the Battle of the Bulge, survived through the heroism of men I barely knew, and spent the next 80 years trying to understand why I lived when better men died. This is my testimony, raw and direct, about what happened in the frozen Ardennes, about the terrible arithmetic of survival, about learning that sometimes being spared has a purpose you won't understand until decades later. My name is Raymond Joseph Mitchell, and I arrived in Europe in November 1944 as a replacement in the 99th Infantry Division, a green unit that had only been in combat for a few weeks and was holding what was considered a quiet sector of the Belgian-German border in the Ardennes forest. I was 19 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, had gone through basic training, but had never heard a shot fired in anger, had never seen a dead body, had never been tested in any way that mattered. I'd volunteered for the army in early 1944, after my best friend was killed in Normandy, driven by anger and grief and a naive belief that I could somehow avenge his death by killing Germans. But anger and grief aren't courage, and believing you're brave isn't the same as actually being brave. And I was about to learn the difference in the most humiliating and traumatic way possible. The 99th Division was positioned along the Belgian-German border near the towns of Krinkelt and Rocherath, holding a thinly defended line in terrain that military planners had decided was unsuitable for major offensive operations. The Ardennes forest was dense, the roads were poor, the weather was terrible, and conventional wisdom said the Germans wouldn't attack through such difficult terrain. That conventional wisdom was catastrophically wrong. The Germans were massing their last reserves for one final desperate offensive, and they were massing them directly opposite our sector, preparing to punch through our lines with overwhelming force and drive for Antwerp in a last gamble to split the Allied forces and force a negotiated peace. I joined Company B, 394th Infantry Regiment on December 10, 1944, assigned to a rifle squad led by Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, a combat veteran who'd been with the division since its arrival in Europe. My squad consisted of 10 men including myself, a mix of veterans and replacements, and they regarded me with the mixture of pity and contempt that experienced soldiers reserve for green troops who haven't proven themselves. I didn't blame them for that attitude. Understood that I'd have to earn their respect through performance, had to demonstrate I could be trusted in combat before they'd accept me as one of them. But I never got the chance to earn that respect through gradual introduction to combat, through small engagements that would build confidence and competence. Instead, my first combat experience was the opening bombardment of the Battle of the Bulge, the largest German offensive on the Western Front, and I was thrown into the deep end without any preparation or transition. The German offensive began at 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, with a massive artillery barrage that shattered the frozen morning and announced the beginning of what would become the bloodiest battle American forces fought in Europe. Thousands of shells fell on our positions. German armor and infantry poured through gaps in our lines, and within hours the entire front was in chaos. My company was in log-reinforced foxholes at the edge of the forest when the barrage began, and I experienced terror for the first time in my life, real existential terror that went beyond fear into something primal and overwhelming. The shells were falling all around us. The noise was beyond anything I'd imagined. The ground was shaking, trees were exploding into splinters, and men were screaming as hot metal fragments tore through flesh and bone. I was in my foxhole, pressed against the frozen earth, hands over my helmet, eyes closed, praying to a God I'd never been particularly devout to, begging to survive, promising anything if I could just live through the next few minutes. I wasn't thinking about my training or my duty or my squad mates. I was thinking only about myself, about survival, about not dying in this frozen forest thousands of miles from home. The artillery barrage lifted after maybe 45 minutes, though it felt like hours, and German infantry began advancing through the forest toward our positions. That's when Sergeant Morrison was yelling at us to get ready, to prepare to engage, to get on our rifles and do our jobs. The other men in the squad were responding, were checking their weapons, were positioning themselves to fire, were functioning despite the terror, because that's what training and discipline and experience allowed them to do. But I couldn't move. My body had shut down, overcome by fear so complete that I was paralyzed, unable to respond to commands or to the obvious danger approaching. I could see German soldiers moving through the trees maybe 100 yards away, could hear Morrison yelling at me to get on my weapon, could hear the other men firing, but I couldn't make my hands move, couldn't make myself respond. I was frozen, not from the cold, but from fear. And in that moment I understood I was a coward, understood that all my anger and grief and desire for vengeance meant nothing when actual combat arrived. The Germans were getting closer, maybe 50 yards now, and the fire from my squad was intense, but we were outnumbered, and Morrison was still yelling at me to shoot, to do something, to help. But I couldn't. I was locked in place, useless, a liability rather than an asset. And then Private Eddie Kowalski, who'd been in the foxhole next to mine, came out of his position under fire, ran to my foxhole, grabbed me by my jacket, and physically shook me, his face inches from mine, screaming, "Mitchell, snap out of it. We need you. Fight or we all die." Something in his voice or his eyes or the physical contact broke through my paralysis, and suddenly I could move again, could feel my hands responding, could think beyond the overwhelming fear. I got on my rifle, started firing at the German soldiers I could see through the trees, just pulling the trigger and working the bolt and firing again, not aiming with any precision, but at least doing something, at least contributing. But that moment of paralysis, those minutes when I'd frozen while other men fought, that would define me for the rest of my life. The German attack was beaten back. We held our position for another hour, and then we were ordered to withdraw to secondary positions closer to Krinkelt, as the entire division line adjusted to the massive German offensive. We fell back in reasonable order, taking casualties but maintaining unit cohesion. And I moved with my squad in a daze, still processing what had happened, still confronting the knowledge that I'd frozen in my first combat. During a brief lull that afternoon, Sergeant Morrison pulled me aside and asked me directly if I was going to be able to function, if he could count on me, if I was going to freeze again the next time we were in combat. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that I'd never experienced anything like that morning's terror and couldn't predict how I'd react next time. He looked at me for a long moment, then said something I've never forgotten. "Mitchell, fear is normal. Every man here is scared, myself included. The difference between a soldier and a coward is what you do despite the fear. This morning you froze, you let your squad down, and men could have died because of it. Kowalski risked his life to snap you out of it when he should have been fighting. You owe him, and you owe every man in this squad. So you better figure out how to function despite fear, because we've got a long fight ahead, and we need every rifle we can get." I promised I'd do better, promised I wouldn't freeze again, but I didn't know if I could keep that promise. Fear of that magnitude isn't something you can just will away through determination or shame. It's a physical response, a shutting down of rational thought and voluntary control, and I wasn't sure I could prevent it from happening again. The next test came that night, December 16th, when German forces attacked our new positions in and around Krinkelt. The fighting was close and brutal, house-to-house combat in the darkness, Germans trying to break through and American forces trying to hold long enough for other units to establish defensive lines to the west. My squad was defending a house on the edge of town, and around 2300 hours, German infantry hit our position with overwhelming force. The fight was chaos, muzzle flashes in the darkness, grenades exploding, men screaming, the smell of powder smoke and blood and fear, and I felt it starting again, that overwhelming terror that had paralyzed me that morning, that desire to shut down and hide and let someone else deal with the danger. But this time, I had Sergeant Morrison's words in my head, and I had the memory of Kowalski risking his life to help me. And I had the knowledge that if I froze again, men would die because of my cowardice. So I fought it, fought the fear, forced myself to keep moving and shooting and functioning even though every instinct was screaming at me to stop. I wasn't heroic, wasn't particularly effective, was just barely maintaining minimal combat capability. But I didn't freeze, didn't shut down, didn't let my squad down. And that night, in that desperate fight in Crinkled, I took my first life, shot a German soldier who was maybe 10 yards away, saw him fall, and didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, or anything except relief that he wasn't going to kill me. We held Crinkled through that night and into the next day, December 17th, but by afternoon it was clear the position couldn't be held indefinitely. German forces were infiltrating around us. We were in danger of being cut off and surrounded, and Division ordered a withdrawal to positions further west near Elsenborn Ridge. The withdrawal was conducted under fire, units leapfrogging back while other units provided covering fire. And that's when I learned the terrible reason I hadn't been meant to die in that first combat. We were withdrawing through a forest road, my squad moving back while another squad provided covering fire, when German machine gun fire from an unexpected position caught us in the open. Men started falling, and we all dove for whatever cover we could find. I ended up behind a fallen log with Private Tommy Henderson from Georgia, a kid who'd been in the squad for 3 months and who'd been one of the few soldiers to show me any kindness when I'd arrived as a replacement. We were pinned down, couldn't move forward or back without exposing ourselves to the machine gun, and we were stuck there while the rest of the squad withdrew past us. Henderson looked at me and said quietly, "We're gonna have to make a run for it, Mitchell. On 3 we go together, zigzag pattern, move fast and hope they miss. You ready?" I nodded, terrified but knowing there was no alternative. Henderson counted down, 1, 2, 3, go. We both jumped up and started running, sprinting through the forest toward where our squad had taken cover about 50 yards away. The German machine gun opened up immediately, tracers arcing through the trees, rounds snapping past us, and I was running faster than I'd ever run in my life. And then Henderson, who was maybe 3 steps ahead of me, suddenly jerked and fell, hit multiple times by the machine gun fire that had been tracking us both. I stopped, turned back toward him, and he was on the ground, blood everywhere, trying to crawl but unable to move his legs. He looked at me and gasped, "Keep going, Mitchell. Get to cover. Don't stop." But I couldn't leave him, couldn't abandon him to die alone in that forest. I turned back, started toward him to try to pull him to cover, and Sergeant Morrison came out of nowhere, running low, firing his rifle at the German position to suppress them. Morrison reached Henderson first, assessed his wounds in a glance, looked at me and screamed, "Mitchell, get to cover now. That's an order." Then Morrison grabbed Henderson and started dragging him back toward our lines, exposed to the German machine gun, taking all the risk himself to save one wounded private. I ran to cover, reached the position where my squad had taken shelter, turned to see if Morrison and Henderson were going to make it. Morrison was still dragging Henderson, maybe 20 yards from safety when the German machine gun found them again. Both men were hit, Morrison multiple times in the chest and Henderson again in the back. They went down together, and I could see they were both dead or dying, and I understood in that instant that Morrison had saved me, had ordered me to cover so I wouldn't be killed trying to save Henderson, had sacrificed himself to get a wounded man to safety. Other squad members suppressed the German position and retrieved the bodies after the Germans withdrew. Henderson was dead, had probably been dead since the first burst hit him. Morrison was still alive but barely, sucking chest wounds that no field medic could treat, dying in the snow while we all stood around helpless. He looked at me with fading eyes and said, "You ran back for Henderson. That took guts, Mitchell. You're going to be okay." But then he died, and I was standing there covered in his blood, knowing he'd given his life partly to save Henderson, but also to save me from my own foolish bravery. That night, huddled in a foxhole near Elsenborn Ridge, I tried to process what had happened. In the space of 2 days, I'd gone from freezing in my first combat to fighting despite overwhelming fear, to almost getting killed trying to save a fellow soldier. And 2 men had died, Henderson and Morrison, both of them better soldiers than I was. Both of them veterans who'd survived months of combat only to die in a desperate withdrawal protecting a green replacement who'd frozen in his first fight. The arithmetic was brutal and inescapable. They were dead and I was alive, and there was no logical or fair reason for that outcome. I should have been the one killed. I was the expendable replacement. I was the soldier who'd frozen and failed. But Henderson had been hit by fire meant for both of us, and Morrison had died getting him out while ordering me to safety. They'd protected me, had paid with their lives for my survival, and I had no idea why or what I was supposed to do with that knowledge. Over the following days, as we fought to hold Elsenborn Ridge against repeated German attacks, I came to understand something about combat and survival and the terrible randomness of war. Henderson and Morrison hadn't died for me specifically. They'd died doing their duties, trying to accomplish their missions, operating according to training and instinct. Henderson had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught by machine gun fire that could just as easily have killed me. Morrison had been doing what squad leaders do, protecting his men, trying to save a wounded soldier, making the choice to risk himself rather than ordering someone else to take the risk. But the result was the same regardless of intent. They were dead and I was alive, and I was carrying the weight of that survival. And as the battle continued, as more men were killed and wounded, as the 99th Division fought desperately to hold Elsenborn Ridge and prevent a German breakthrough, I started to understand why I'd survived. Not because I was special or chosen or meant for some grand purpose, but because someone had to survive. Someone had to carry the memories and tell the stories and bear witness to what had happened. The Battle of the Bulge lasted through December and into January. The 99th Division fought through all of it, and I survived despite numerous close calls and situations where I probably should have been killed. I stopped freezing in combat, learned to function despite fear, became a competent if not exceptional soldier. But I never forgot that first battle. Never forgot freezing in my foxhole while other men fought. Never forgot Henderson dying 3 steps ahead of me. Never forgot Morrison sacrificing himself partly to save me from my own foolishness. The division eventually moved back on the offensive, pushed the Germans back through the ground we'd lost in December, and by February 1945, we were advancing into Germany. I fought through the rest of the war, survived until the German surrender in May, came home to Pennsylvania in the summer of 1945, and I came home carrying the weight of survivor's guilt, the knowledge that I'd lived through combat where better men had died, the question of why I'd been spared when I'd frozen in my first fight. I tried to live normally, used the GI Bill to finish college, became a high school teacher, married and raised 4 children. But I carried Morrison and Henderson with me every day, carried the memory of their deaths and the knowledge that I owed them everything. I'd visit their families when I could, tell them about their son's bravery, try to keep their memories alive. Henderson's mother told me once that knowing her son had died trying to help others made the loss slightly more bearable. And Morrison's father said he was proud his son had been the kind of leader who'd risk himself for his men. But I also carried the shame of having frozen in my first combat. The knowledge that for a crucial few minutes I'd been useless, had been a liability rather than an asset. I never told anyone about that, never shared that particular failure, kept it as a private shame that defined how I saw myself. I'd frozen, I'd failed, and only the intervention of Kowalski and the sacrifice of Morrison and Henderson had allowed me to survive and eventually become the kind of soldier I should have been from the start. It took decades before I could talk about the Battle of the Bulge at all, before I could share any part of that experience with family or students or anyone who asked about my war service. And it took even longer before I could confront the question of why I'd survived, what meaning there was in being spared when better men died. The easy answer would be that there is no meaning, that survival in combat is random and luck-based, and attempting to find purpose in it is futile. But I couldn't accept that answer, couldn't believe that Henderson and Morrison died for nothing, couldn't believe my survival was meaningless. The answer, when it finally came to me in my 60s, was simpler and more mundane than I'd expected. I survived to remember, to bear witness, to tell the stories of men who couldn't tell their own stories. Morrison and Henderson and all the others who died in the Ardennes in December 1944. They needed someone to survive who'd known them, who'd seen what they did, who could testify to their courage and their sacrifice. That was my purpose, that was why I'd been spared. Despite freezing in my first combat, despite deserving death as much as or more than the men who'd actually died, So I became a teacher partly to have a platform for sharing their stories, for making sure each generation of students knew about the Battle of the Bulge and the 99th Infantry Division, and men like Morrison and Henderson, who'd held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. I joined veteran groups, participated in reunions, spoke at memorial services, did everything I could to keep their memories alive. And I tried to live a life worthy of the sacrifice that had preserved mine. Tried to be the kind of man that Morrison had died believing I could become. I'm 96 years old now, and most of the men who fought in the Battle of the Bulge are gone, taken by time after surviving the battle that should have killed us all. Kowalski died in 2001, never having fully recovered from frostbite damage to his feet sustained during those frozen December days. The few other survivors from my squad are scattered across the country, elderly men carrying memories of frozen foxholes and desperate fights and friends who didn't make it home. Before I join them, before the last of us are gone, I wanted to tell this story, to give testimony about what happened in December 1944, to preserve some record of the men who fought and died in the Ardennes. This is my testimony, raw and direct, about freezing in my first combat and learning through the deaths of better men that survival carries obligations, that being spared demands that you honor those who weren't spared, that sometimes the terrifying reason you weren't meant to die is simply that someone needed to survive to remember. Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison was 26 years old when he died dragging Private Tommy Henderson to safety. He was from Ohio, had a wife and infant daughter he'd never see again, had been a carpenter before the war and had planned to open his own business after the war. He died doing his duty, protecting his men, embodying the kind of leadership that kept units functioning in desperate situations. Private Tommy Henderson was 19 years old when he died, cut down by German machine gun fire while withdrawing through a frozen forest. He was from a small town in Georgia, had been a high school athlete, had volunteered for service after Pearl Harbor. He died in front of me, died taking bullets that could have hit me, died 3 steps ahead of where I was running. They deserved to live more than I did, were better soldiers, better men, more valuable to the war effort and to their families and to the future. But they died, and I lived. And I've spent 80 years trying to honor that random distribution of fate by remembering them and sharing their stories and bearing witness to what they did and who they were. The rookie soldier who froze in combat, who was saved by men he barely knew, who learned that survival can be both blessing and burden. That's who I was and in some ways still am. The shame of that moment never fully leaves, never stops influencing how I see myself, never becomes just a historical event that happened long ago. But I've learned to carry it alongside the pride of having eventually functioned, having become a competent soldier, having survived to fulfill the obligation of memory that Morrison and Henderson's deaths imposed on me. If this story moved you, if it helped you understand the complexity of survival and the weight of memory, and the obligation we owe to those who died, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison and Private Tommy Henderson and all the others who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, who held the line in frozen foxholes, who died so others could live and so the German offensive could be stopped. They were heroes, and they deserve to be remembered. Thank you for listening to this old soldier's testimony about December 1944, and about learning the terrifying reason he wasn't meant to die.